Episode 8, AD 840 to 990. Our commonly held perception of the Dark Ages is associated with an image of the sacking of Roman cities by wild, shag-bearded, horn-helmeted barbarians. The so-called darkness is seen as having descended precipitously with the fall of the Roman state in the West in the late 400s AD. This is the conventional view, and it needs to be radically adjusted to accord with the evidence. The really serious catastrophes occurred much later, 2 to 3 centuries later in fact. We have seen in the previous episode how enormous the shock effect wrought by the Islamic invasions had been, on both the Roman Empire of Constantinople and on the remaining Christian parts of the Occident. We have also seen the bright beginnings of a political and cultural recovery laid by Charlemagne and his successors. But there came real, bearded and destruction-wreaking barbarians, and they began to come around the year 800, and in waves, bringing fire and the sword to very wide areas of the Occident, for a century and more. This was the real Dark Age for Western Europe. The end of the Roman state had been followed by the replacement of the ruling class in Gaul, Spain and parts of Italy by a Romanized, or Christianizing and Romanizing, military elite. The Islamic invasions had overwhelmed Roman Africa and Spain and shattered forever the organic unity of the Mediterranean world. The knock-on economic and cultural effects had been most severe. But the direct destruction of the continent during the century 850 to 950 was a deliberate trampling and physical devastation of everything standing, in the search for loot and slaves. The Occident, Europe, was not just set back, it was ransacked and thrown down. It appeared at one point that it would not survive at all. But it did survive. When the great peril had passed, in the later 900s, the whole political and social fabric of society emerged transformed. Society had not just been fragmented politically, economically, and even socially, it had been reduced to its smallest constituent parts. A true political, and with it a social, revolution had occurred. Where did this destructiveness come from? It came from the south in the form of Islamic raids from North Africa and Spain that lasted throughout the long period we are addressing. It also came from a new source, from the north, when raiding flotillas of longships began appearing off the coasts of Anglia, Scotland and Ireland, and on those of northern Francia. Half a century later, by 900, these predators had been supplemented by a new influx of savage horsemen from the steppes around the Caspian Sea, the Magyars. To understand how these forces of predation were all unleashed during this period, we first need to shift our gaze far to the east, outside Europe, where developments were taking place which had important consequences and which provided the context within which these waves of predation in the West occurred. The true superpower of the age was the Islamic Caliphate, where a single individual reigning at Baghdad held sway over a vast empire stretching from present-day Pakistan to the western Mediterranean. The Abbasid caliphs had come to power in the 750s with the promise of returning the Ummah of the people of Islam to its original purity by murdering the so-called corrupt Umayyad Caliph and his family at Damascus, and then by moving their capital to Baghdad. The political, that is the religious, promise of the caliphs did not succeed in uniting the Muslim populations of the cities, who were, and still are, bitterly divided between Sunni and Shia. Nor did their promise of restoring the original purity of the community of the believers lend their regime the legitimacy it needed. The divisions between Sunni and Shia were too deep and already irreconcilable. Political legitimacy came, in the eyes of all Muslims, from the passing by Muhammad of his authority to this or that of his companions. There could be no other religiously sanctioned basis for political power, and the alternative stories of how the Prophet passed on his authority were precisely where the Sunni and Shia conflict arose. Instead of a legitimized wielding of power, supported by a public space where free men participated in social cohesion, the crucial religious authority was monopolized by the wise men outside of politics, the ulema, called the scholars, meaning that they devoted their energies to the study of the Quran and to the finer points of the Islamic religious tradition. These men, people of religious authority, did appear at court, but otherwise lived as a disinterested and a passive opposition to the caliphal regime, withdrawn from the political sphere. The caliphs remained the champions of the honor of Islam, but their court was by definition a suspect and corrupt deviation from the purity of the original vision. The result was a depoliticized society where the power players, the generals and provincial governors, could always exploit religious disaffection to rise in revolt, as they frequently did. The caliphs, for all their astonishing wealth and large armies, were constantly in fear of conspiracies and riots in Baghdad and of armed revolts in this or that province. This explains why the spy network they maintained was so pervasive and why the postal system to keep them informed was so well maintained. To deal with their problems, they turned ever more to employ mawali, converted ex-slaves, as their guards and administrators, people of low status despised by respectable members of society. But these too proved unreliable. Gradually, by stages, the caliphs discovered that captured and enslaved Turkomen from beyond the Oxus River made excellent guards and soldiers. They were complete outsiders, feared, hated, and despised by the people of the caliphate, and as the personal slaves of the caliph, they were a highly efficient instrument of power. The main body of the army, composed of free men, became turbulent, as these complete aliens were given the choicest military duties and their leaders elevated to the highest ranks. The regulars also clamoured for their wages to be increased and even to be paid. The Turkic slave guards swaggered in the streets of Baghdad, committed crimes and even murders, and were not reprimanded. A man called Ibn Landak wrote at this time, quote, "Whom do I meet when I look around? Apes riding on saddles." End quote. In 836, under the caliph who fully committed his regime to the slave soldiers, al-Mutasim, there were serious riots in Baghdad against the Mamluks, for that is what they were called. The word Mamluk meant one possessed, as in belonging to a master, a possession. The caliph responded to the riots by building a great barracks city, Samarra, 60 miles upriver on the Tigris. Samarra was the physical manifestation of the bankruptcy of the original Muslim political project, exactly 2 centuries after its initiation. Socially and religiously condoned authority lay with the ulema in the cities, whose Sharia law was dispensed by the Qadi or judge. In contrast to these, with the caliph lay raw power. His elite slave bodyguards, his spy network, his slaved tax gatherers, his immense revenues, and a most formidable standing army of foreign slave soldiers, completely isolated, culturally by their background and now physically by Samarra, from the society they kept in subjugation. The foreign and abject slaves of the caliph were the tyrannical masters of the society. Very quickly, of course, the slaves became the masters of the caliphs themselves. In 861, Caliph al-Muwatakil was struck down and murdered by one of his Turkish slave soldiers. From then on, for the reigns of the next 6 or 7 caliphs who resided in the barracks city of Samarra, it was the Turkic chiefs and officers who decided who would be the next caliph and be beholden to them. Things degenerated further. The Turkish officers conspired against one another for power. Palace coups followed one upon the next. As Baghdad and Samarra were consumed in internal struggles, the provincial governors ran their own affairs, established their own dynasties, and the caliphate became fragmented. This is the context in which an autonomous Egyptian emirate broke away from central control, as did one in Ifriqiya, first under the Aghlabids and later under the Fatimids. The former were faced with the same problem as the caliphs at Baghdad: the religio-political opposition of the ulema and Sharia jurists of Kairouan, and their answer was similar. They built the, to them, loyal city of Al-Abbasiyya outside Kairouan for their unruly soldiers. Faced with revolts within the warriors and swinging moral criticism from the Qadi Assad, the emir appointed this Assad to undertake jihad against the cities of Roman Sicily, whose slow agony of conquest by the Muslims began in 827 AD. Similarly, in Cordova, the Umayyad emirs were faced with revolts among their clients and opposition from the ulema. Their response was ruthless. In our present culture, Islamic Al-Andalus in Spain is viewed with especially rose-tinted glasses as the pinnacle of civilized tolerance and social progress, enjoying an almost Atlantis-type legendary status. But to take just one example for a flavour of this polity, in 805, Emir al-Hakam, when faced with a typical revolt among his leading military men, had 72 of them summarily crucified in a line along the banks of the Guadalquivir, facing the city walls for all to see. Later in 818, a revolt fomented by the ulema and their circle of urban notables was dealt with by having 300 of them publicly crucified. And it was precisely in these breakaway emirates of Ifriqiya and Al-Andalus between 800 and 820 that the institution of the slave armies first made their appearance. They arose in these peripheries because the essential political problem of legitimacy and loyalty in a radically disenfranchised and despotic society was the same, whether in Baghdad on the Tigris or in Cordova on the Guadalquivir. Social and political relations were entirely different on the other side of the Christian world, in the forested pagan north. From Charlemagne's position, these were the barbarians beyond the Saxon barbarians whom he had just subdued. The Romans would have regarded them as people of the Germanic genus or kind, in their arms, military and social organization, and general way of life. By the late 700s, their kings, Conga, were beginning to be able to exert some real power and influence in an otherwise hugely independent society. The dynamic little merchant port cum naval base at Birka, deep in the inland lakes of central Sweden, but with passage to the sea, was founded by an act of the king, who resided at nearby Hovgården. For reasons that are still unclear, in the late 700s, this Scandinavian barbarian society began to send out parties of armed adventurer traders and raiders. These activities of trading and raiding were aspects of one another and not incompatible. Already in the 740s, exploratory expeditions from Birka had found their way from the Baltic into Lake Ladoga, behind present-day St. Petersburg, and down the Volkhov river system. They brought back furs, which were in high demand, as well as amber, honey, slaves, and other goods. By 753, they had established a trading way station at Aldeuborg, now known in Russian as Staraya Lagoda, near Smolensk. They traded with some, and they extracted tribute from others. With incredible hardiness, they sailed south down the Dnieper and the Volga river systems, sometimes having to bring their boats from one riverbed to the next over land, until in the late 700s they reached the Caspian and the Black Seas. Across the Black Sea lay Constantinople. Across the Caspian lay the land routes down to Baghdad. The Norsemen presented themselves at Baghdad as Christians, which they weren't, and thereby obtained the status of dhimmi, obliging them to pay the jizya and be subject to other restrictions, but with the permission to trade peaceably. Walking through the crowded souks of Baghdad, the Norse must have felt like men who had landed on the moon. 250,000 Baghdadi dirhams have so far been dug up in archaeological excavations in Sweden, All of them come from this time and in this way in exchange for amber fur and Slavic slaves. The Norse way stations through central Russia became more substantial, with two great centers, one at Kiev in the south in the 880s and the other at Novgorod in the north, 920. These towns soon built defensive walls, operated an organized urban life, and have become power bases in their own right. The Finns, their Baltic neighbors, had known the Norsemen as Rusti, from their homeland in central Sweden, called Rodin or Roslagen. The Slavs took the Finnish name and turned it into Rus. Russia, the Russian word for Russia, was originally the name for Sweden. By the mid-900s, the Norse nobility at Novgorod and at Kiev were intermarrying with their local Slavic peers. Their names, originally Nordic like Helgi and Ivar, became Oleg and Igor. By the third or fourth generation, this tradition expires, and the leaders of these cities are called Sviatoslav, Vladimir, and Yaroslav. The germ of what, after many long centuries, was to emerge as Russia had taken root. Much closer to home and easier to reach were the islands of Britannia. We should now maybe call it Anglia or Anglaland, and Ireland. Through the 600s and 700s, Irish monks had been establishing little monastic centres in Scotia. At this time and later, Scotia could refer to Ireland or Scotland or both, such as at Iona, Lindisfarne and Jarrow. These had been beacons of Christian missionary enterprise to the tribal elites of the several Saxon and other Germanic kingdoms to the south, where they were joined by missionaries sent out directly from Rome. By this date, the once pagan elites had been baptized and had become zealous to assimilate to the culture and religious ethos of Francia and of Rome. The monks at the outposts at Lindisfarne and Jarrow probably thought of themselves to be at the extremity of human settlement, and therefore safe from the side of the sea. If they did, they were wrong. Already in 792, churches in Kent were contributing money for a common defence against the pagan sea raiders. But the first great Viking raid on Lindisfarne happened in 793. The monastery at Jarrow was sacked and burned in 794, followed by monastic settlements on Skye, at Iona and Rathlin Island. A few years later, in 799, the first raid on the continent of Europe was made at the mouth of the Loire upon the monastery of Saint-Philibert at Noirmoutier. These were Western Norse from Norway and Denmark. The Irish monks who wrote about these events first called them all simply pagans. And what can you expect from pagans other than murder, robbery, and destruction? Their laments were loud. Later, these monks distinguished between the types of foreigners, or gaul, as they were called in Irish. These were white or blonde foreigners, fiongaul, from Norway, and dark, perhaps dark-haired ones, duvgaul. Today, the North City Dublin Council is called Fingal County Council, from Fiongaul, I believe. The longship raids increased in scale and frequency through the first half of the 800s. But from 856 onwards, Norse warrior bands were setting up base camps on islands in the river estuaries of the Loire, the Seine, the Scheldt, the Rhine and the Weser, and used them to launch devastating seasonal raids into the Frankish interior. Their preferred targets were, of course, the monasteries. The Frankish realm at this point, in the mid-800s, was subdivided once again according to Frankish custom and was ruled by 2 or 3 brother kings. Dissensions between them were deepening. Each would try to steal a piece of the other's dominions while he was embroiled elsewhere trying to fend off the Vikings. Quite often, even in the midst of the deepest and most destructive Norse campaigns, a Frankish king would prioritize his struggle against his brother rather than use his forces to protect his monasteries and cities against them. Between 856 and 859, various Norse bands set out from their estuary bases to cut long swathes of destruction upriver. They attacked Paris, burned Bayeux, Chartres, Tours, Blois, Noyon and Amiens. they ravaged the interior from the mouth of the Scheldt. In 865, the Norse on the Loire burnt Poitiers and Orléans, and the Seine Norse burned around Saint-Denis in the same year. In 866, Carolus, king of West Francia, had to pay them an enormous tribute to go elsewhere. As another symptom of desperation and political weakness, this same Carolus was obliged to grant 3 great fiefs to his counts as a buffer against the assailants. This recognized their authority as self-sufficient lords in their counties. He gave the county of Flanders to his son-in-law, Balduinus or Baudouin, in 862. Neustria was entrusted to Robert the Strong, the Duchy of Burgundy to Richard, Count of Autun. Brittany, under its own comital elite, regained its independence and petitioned Rome to grant it its own, we could call it, national archbishop. Aquitaine went its own way as an independent duchy. In the 870s, the counties of Anjou and Champagne detached themselves from Neustria. And so it was that under the impact of the Norse raids, during the 880s, Carolingian Gaul buckled and began to disintegrate. And from it began to emerge the great counties and duchies of the France we recognize from the High Middle Ages. The Vikings were relentless and almost irresistible. In 879, a Norse host took Ghent, and the following year they burnt Cambrai and Arras. The year after that, in 881, they sacked Maastricht, Liège, Köln, Bonn, Stavelot, Malmedy, Prüm, Trier, and finally Aachen itself, smashing Charlemagne's very sarcophagus in the Palatine Chapel. The Weser Norse burnt the recently founded settlement of Hamburg. The Western Emperor was now Carolus III, from 881, known in English as Charles the Fat. He gave Gottfried the Dane a duchy in Frisia in exchange for being baptized. But Gottfried's Norse warbands of the Rhine went on to sack Deventer, Duisburg, and Reims, settling in Amiens for the winter of 883-4. Previously, the Frankish kings had given the Norse enormous bribes to desist from their attacks. Now they were being given whole duchies. The climax of the decentralized Viking raiding movement came in November 885, when the largest Danish army ever seen, together with their families, sailed up the Seine to Paris, promising to spare the city, if allowed, past the fortified Ile de la Cité unharmed. Bishop Gozolin, parleying with Siegfried, one of their leaders, refused. The first assault across one of the only 2 bridges to the island was repulsed, with 300 Danes being killed. A full-scale siege then began. As was normal in the Frankish world, authority within the Christian city of Paris was shared by this bishop and Count Odo, a relative of the Emperor Carolus. In an epic struggle over the winter of 885-886, repeated assaults were attempted upon the bridges and the tower overlooking them. Bishop Gozolin fought in chainmail and helmet on the battlements of Paris alongside the ordinary defenders. Quote, Gozolinus erat primus super omnes. Gozolin was first above all, says the chronicler Abbo, who witnessed the siege, and it was in fighting the Danes that he was killed. Such action had previously been thought scandalous in a clergyman. It remained unthinkable for a priest of the Roman Empire in the East to don armour and fight. But in the West, the extremity of the situation and the need for moral leadership made an armed, sword-wielding bishop a necessity. At night, the citizens of Paris could hear the Norse womenfolk keening as the bodies of their husbands and sons who had been killed that day were burned on the pagan funeral pyres in the Danish camp. Count Odo led a party to break out of the city and rode to the emperor to beseech him to come with a relief army, which in due course he did, choosing not to fight the Danes but to give them a rich payment of 800 pounds of silver and free passage upriver to Burgundy, where they continued their predation. In 887, the year following the lifting of the Danish siege of Paris, the emperor called an assembly of the empire at Frankfurt. Soon news arrived that one of his counts, Arnulf of Carinthia, was marching to depose him. Quite quickly, his political support among the great nobles of the East melted away. He agreed to abdicate and was promised some of the choice imperial villas in Swabia, Schwaben, to retire to, and died a few months later. The Carolingian dynasty was losing the right to the emperorship of the Latin Occident. In 891, this Arnulf took on the Vikings at the Battle of Leuven, the present-day Flanders, slaughtering so many of the Norsemen that the chronicler says their bodies dammed up the flow of the river. This put an end to their predations from the mouth of the river Scheldt into the Low Countries and beyond, which had lasted for the previous 35 years. In that same year, the Norse who had infested the mouth of the Loire for half a century were defeated and driven from their peninsular base at Noirmoutier-en-Île. Gradually, in the late 800s, the Vikings were being effectively opposed and increasingly defeated. In the previous decade, the pagan Danes had looked set to conquer the whole of the island of Britannia permanently. They were opposed by the king of the Principality of Wessex, Elfrid, who had first desperately struggled to hold them off and finally defeated their advance in 878. This led to the division of the island along the line of the old Roman military road, since called Watling Street. The east of the country became the Danelaw, where the law of the Danes applied, with its main port and trading centre at the old Roman city of Eboracum, now Jorvik, or York. There is a layer of eastern England which still bears traces of its having once been a Scandinavian country. Place names, for one thing, reveal this. The once important monastery of St. Hilda at Struneshall was destroyed by the Norse and given a new name, Hvidabu, White Town, which is retained today as Whitby. From Greenland through the Orkneys to Norway and from Denmark to eastern England and of all of coastal Ireland, a single Norse region was taking shape. But a counter-process was already afoot which would simply dissolve the effects of this barbarian conquest. The savage Norsemen, so cruel in their looting and burning of monasteries, were falling under the pull of Christianity's cultural attraction. Viking chieftains who entered into deals or were defeated understood that the peace treaty would entail their acceptance of baptism, as happened with Gottfried on the Scheldt in 882 and Guthrum in England in 878. Archaeologists have found Christian objects in their digs at Jorvik, and such finds become the norm in Viking sites dating from the 900s onwards. In West Francia, the Normanni, as they were called, had held the Lower Seine in their grip for 70 years. In 911 AD, the king granted their war leader Hrolf, or Rollo, a large duchy to himself. Hrolf accepted baptism and took the name of Rotbertus, Robert, founding what would soon become the powerful duchy of Normandy, Normandia, land of the Northmen. His immediate task was to prevent his cousins back in Denmark from mounting any further raids along the Channel coast, which he did. The Danes of the Cherbourg Peninsula and of Normandy generally were quick to embrace not only Christianity, but also the Latin language as it was then spoken in the region, and the whole Frankish Christian way of life and value system. They would soon become, within just a generation or two, the most formidable and aggressive exponents of the Latin Christian ethos. But as if in relay, just as the Vikings were beginning the long process of giving up their roving to seek a settled life as landed nobility and as merchants, a new tribal people of remarkable barbarity arrived in the Pannonian Plain, modern Hungary, to use it as a base to launch vast predatory raids deep into Christendom. These were the Magyars. These were genuine savages. The sources report their chieftains whipping them forward into battle. For they had come from that great nursery of savagery, the steppe lands that stretched from the Ukraine to Mongolia. The Huns had emerged from there in the 400s, to be followed by the Avars somewhat later. Indeed, so many and shifting are the names of these yurt-dwelling, horse-breeding pastoral nomads that the labels applied to them tend to lose their usefulness. The Magyars were neighbours in the Caspian region with the Turks, who were at this time being brought in large numbers to Baghdad to form the Caliph's slave armies. The harsh life of the steppes and the intertribal wars that were a way of life there produced highly effective fighters. In the 850s, another horse horde, the Pechenegs, propelled the Magyars westward towards the Danube. There, some of them were recruited by Arnulf of Carinthia in his campaigns in Bohemia and Moravia. He soon found that he had bitten off far more than he could chew. They were also employed by the Constantinopolitan Emperor Leo VI to make war on his own enemies, the Bulgars. In the Greek Roman chronicles, they were usually referred to as Turkoi, Turks. The region they occupied was called by the Greeks Turkia, Turkey. In 895-896, they rode in large numbers into the rich grasslands of the Hungarian plain, as so many of their steppe predecessors had in the centuries before. From there they could mount raiding expeditions to the west and to the south at will. When they withdrew from such deep thrusts into settled regions, they left behind the smouldering ruins of towns, monasteries, and villages strewn with dead bodies. They took long lines of roped captives back with them to their grazing lands in Hungary, mainly young people of both sexes who would be capable of surviving the journey. These unfortunates were chosen to fetch a good price from the slave-dealing intermediaries who supplied Damascus and, to a lesser extent, Constantinople. Each spring they launched large-scale raids into northern Italy and East Francia. Their reach was deep. They struck south into the Veneto and Lombardy. Their usual routes were westward through Bavaria and Saxony, sometimes reaching as far as Burgundy. After the last Carolingian emperor, Carolus, had abdicated in 877, a period of political fragmentation and turbulence followed, with no clear leader in East Francia. The leading families of what we have called the stem duchies, which had once been based on the old tribal kinship groups, had, following Christianization by Charlemagne, rapidly become detribalized and culturally assimilated. The counts and dukes were no longer tribal chieftains, but Frankish-style lords, forming intermarried networks of great families whose lordships were no longer necessarily restricted to the tribal homeland. These East Frankish lords chose from among themselves a Rex Francia Orientalis, a king of East Francia, passing the role from family to family as the political balance shifted. By 919, the assembly of these dukes and counts, the Margrafen and Herzöge, elected Henricus, Duke of Saxonia, as their presiding king. He proved to be an excellent choice. Henricus energetically fought the incursions of the Magyars, so successfully that in 926 the Magyars agreed to a 9-year peace in return for an annual payment of a heavy tribute. Henricus, or Heinrich der Finkler in German, used the precious time energetically to build a systematic infrastructure of earth and wood fortress strongpoints along the eastern line of the Frankish frontier. He built up his own authority among the nobility and armed and trained a substantial body of heavy cavalry, the loricati, as we have seen already, with war horse, spear, helmet, and chainmail. He practiced his men by subduing the pagan Slavic tribes all along the Elbe. When in 932 the Magyar party arrived to collect the annual tribute, Henricus threw them a dead dog as his declaration of war. The following year a great battle was fought against the Magyar horde, who used the classic steppe tactics of hit-and-run mounted archery. Against these, Henricus released counterattacks of heavily armoured riders, the Ritterschaft, German for knighthood, who won the day. They turned instead to the south, launching a great raid into Thrace in 934 and a worse one in 943. After which a treaty was negotiated by the Patricios, the patrician, or if you like, the Patrick, Theophanes, with hostages residing in Constantinople. In 948, when the treaty expired, the emperor baptized the third-ranking Magyar chieftain Bultzus. This was not the end of the matter. The Magyars came again during the reign of Henricus' son, Otto. This time they had siege equipment with them, and looked set to capture the city of Augsburg in Bavaria. If this had happened, it would have opened up a threat on a higher scale to the centre of Europe. Otto met the Magyars at Lechfeld, near that city, in August of 955. He had with him all the great counts and dukes of East Francia, with their powerful contingents. This degree of political and military unity around the king had not been seen since the time of Charlemagne. The Magyars were utterly defeated and their horde destroyed. On the field of battle itself, amid the slain and in the rush of victory, the great nobles of East Francia raised Otto on a shield and hailed him Augustus et Imperator, Augustus and Emperor. 6 years later, in 961, Otto led his followers across the Alps to Pavia and then to Rome. The Carolingian count there, Berengarius, who styled himself as Rex Italiae, king of Italy, withdrew to the hills but eventually came and did homage to Otto. The arrival of the all-powerful East Frankish king at Rome enabled Pope Ioannes XII to break free of the tutelage of the powerful Roman family of the Theophylactoi. The Greek name arises from their forebear having been exarch of Italy, whose female leaders were said to have been so powerful that they had been manipulating the papacy for their own purposes for decades. In February 962, the Pope crowned Otto as Roman Emperor and concluded with him a strategic agreement, expressed in the Diploma Ottonianum, in which the new emperor and his successors would use their power in East and Central Francia to protect the papacy from those near at hand who held power, the magnates of Latium, Tusculum and Campania. The old symbiosis between the Transalpine Franks and the Roman papacy was re-established. It had only fallen into abeyance as Carolingian power crumbled. The new power were the Ottonians, but they were based not in Francia proper, but in western and central Germania, a formation that had emerged from Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony. The quid pro quo on the Pope's side was to give Otto authority to appoint certain of his clientele to contested bishoprics, in both East and West Francia, by the way, and to found the monastery and archbishopric of Magdeburg and the Middle Elbe. This right to nominate his own bishops allowed the creation of a power structure where the Western emperor more or less controlled the great bishoprics of the lands of his nominal vassals, where the bishops acted as representatives of the imperial power in their dominions. A century later, a renewed papacy would fight to claw back this concession. The foundation of the new monastery city of Magdeburg was intended as a radial base for the evangelization and, if necessary, the conquest of the Slavic lands of Eastern Europe. Fulda had served this function 2 centuries before for Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony. Now the House of Saxony was consciously employing the same methods beyond the Elbe. From that point on, from about 960 AD, there was a great turn in the fortunes of Christendom. The Magyars were again defeated in 970, this time by the Romans at Arcadiopolis. Thereafter they preferred to settle down to farm the plains of Hungary with their long-horned cattle rather than live from pillaging and slave-taking. In 970, the young Grand Prince of the Western Magyars, Géza, received baptism. In 973, the Magyars were sending 12 envoys to participate in the Frankish assembly or diet held by the Emperor Otto. In 995, his son was married to the Bavarian princess Gisela, and he took the Christian name of Istvan, Stephen. This is what a Christian name, or first name, originally meant. For pagans, it was an identity change, the forsaking of one's old gods together with one's ancestral cultural values. And this trend was becoming a flow. In 960, Harald Blåtand, Bluetooth of Denmark, both united his tribes under his authority and, as part of the same process, persuaded the Danish warrior chieftains to accept baptism. In 997, the sometime Viking raider and mercenary fighting for the East Frankish emperor, Olaf Tryggvason, made himself king of Norway and persuaded the chieftains there to be baptized. A minority of pagan holdouts were persuaded by shows of force. So, in the final decades of the 900s, both the Viking and the Magyar predations had been brought to an end. Latin Christendom had found within itself the military and political resources to mount a fight back. The combination of military force and, above all, the pull of Christian society again worked to disarm entire barbarian peoples and render them not its destroyers, but as new, vital supports to Christendom. However, the whole process, which had lasted a century and more, had been one of death and physical destruction on a massive scale. Europe went through, between 840 and 960, the worst period in its history probably, before or since. It emerged from the mayhem of the late 900s a transformed society. Particularly in the Roman territories of western Francia, in Neustria, Aquitania and Provence, there had been a collapse of all central authority. In the chaos, the villages were at the complete mercy of the raiders, and few cities could defend themselves and avoid being burned. Monasteries were systematically sought out for pillage and burning. For the great majority of the population, the only hope was to seek refuge within a nearby wooden stockade, built on a mound and garrisoned by some of the local lords' men-at-arms. In the mayhem of these long decades, effective military power fragmented and descended to the level of the county, and within the county to the level of the castellan of the district. Any family with some local revenues could build a stockade and establish themselves as a political and military force in their locality. A petty but effective warrior nobility proliferated at a local level, especially in West Francia. At the level of the kingship, the still vibrant political traditions handed down from Charles Martel and Charlemagne, the magnates of the region north of the Loire, Neustria, effectively, collectively chose from among themselves the hero of the siege of Paris, Count Odo, and crowned him as Rex Francorum, King of the Franks, at Compiègne in 888 AD. In West Francia there followed over a century of alternations, between the Carolingians being restored and again being replaced by one of the great nobles, in particular by one of the family of Odo, who became known as the Robertians after Odo's brother Robert le Fort, the Strong. By the 980s, Emperor Otto II of East Francia and Italy was doing everything in his power to repossess and reunite the whole Frankish realm under his authority. In 978 he led 60,000 men to lay siege to Paris. The city's defence was led by a Robertian, Hugues Capet. Disease among Otto's troops forced him into a disastrous retreat back towards the Rhine. When the Carolingian king of West Francia died in 987, Hugues, backed by the Archbishop of Reims, was elected by the magnates of Neustria as Rex Francorum. He based his power on the city of Paris and was the first in an extraordinarily successful family that lasted in power until the 1300s. Within a few years of the turn of the first millennium of the Christian epoch, 1000 AD, a new and unstable equilibrium had emerged from the chaos of the previous century. And it was to be the unstable equilibrium, with modifications, that the politics of Europe were to be played out within for the next 1000 years. It structured Latin Christendom and left its indelible mark on Europe into the modern era. But there was another whole side to the agony of the late 800s and 900s, one which we have left aside until now because it was different in nature. This was the renewed onslaught on Latin Christendom from Islamic Iberia and North Africa. What made the predation in the south different in quality, but not necessarily in character, from that in the north, was that this form was completely immune from the medium and long-term cure that was so highly effective in the north and east. The attraction, conversion, followed by the cultural and political assimilation of the predatory society. This simply did not apply. Islam itself was a powerful magnet of religious and cultural attraction, one strongly resistant to cultural leakage to another. Between 827 and 831, Muslim hit-and-run raids upon the southern coast of Roman Sicily gradually turned into a project for the conquest of the whole island. The Balearic Islands too were taken again. From there, Muslim ships attacked Naples and in 839 sacked Ancona on the opposite side of Italy. In 840 they besieged and captured Bari from the imperial exarch. Twice St. Benedict's monastery at Santa Scholastica at Subiaco, far inland from Rome, was destroyed by the Saracens. This happened in 829 and again in 877. Most shockingly of all, in August 846 a Muslim fleet sailed right up the Tiber and sacked Rome itself, entering, looting and desecrating St. Peter's Basilica and that of San Paolo fuori le mura. The small protective garrison of Frankish, Lombard, Frisian and Saxon warriors fought to the death, trying to keep the Muslim assailants from breaking open the doors of the most sacred basilica in the Occident. Pope Leo appealed to Duke Sergius of Naples to lead a combined force of the galleys of Naples, Amalfi and Gaeta against the Saracens. These cities were still enclaves of the Roman Empire, acknowledging the emperor in Constantinople, but like Venice, effectively ruling themselves. The Pope came personally to address the sailors and soldiers before the encounter. They met the Muslim fleet from Sardinia near Ostia and defeated it, taking many prisoners. Pope Leo used them to build a wall around St. Peter's in the Vatican, the Leonine Wall, named after himself. In 883, the monastery of Monte Cassino, founded by St. Benedict 350 years previously, was sacked and burned by the Muslims. Italy, especially the south and west, was the hunting ground of the emirs of Kairouan in North Africa. The jihadis took Sicily piece by piece over a period of 75 years. The resistance was determined, heroic, and hard to overcome. The Sicilians were used to Muslim raids, which had been going on for centuries. The first was in 652. The subsequent expeditions to have been recorded were in 703 and in every year from 728 to 734, followed by the first attempt at conquest in 740 and again in 752, in 812 and again in 819. A force of 100 ships from Ifriqiya landed in the southwest of Sicily in 827, and the conquest of the island began in earnest. Constantinople repeatedly sent out what forces it could spare, and they were routinely destroyed. In 845, the defeat of a Roman field army at Butera entailed the loss of 10,000 lives. However, defeated at sea and on the battlefield, the Roman authorities and the indigenous Greco-Roman population, in contrast to the pattern in Spain in 711, shut their gates and fought. In 832, Al-Kamet, with an army of 40,000 men, took a whole year to force the defences of Palermo. According to an Islamic source, of the 70,000 defenders inside the city, only 3,000 remained alive after it had been taken. Sicily was falling to Islam, but it was doing so through the hemorrhaging of its people's blood. Outbreaks of cholera slowed down the campaign and required reinforcements to be sent from Ifriqiya. In 859, the 1,000-meter-high natural fortress of Henna was besieged. Known as the Lombilico di Sicilia, the navel of Sicily, this Roman fortress overlooked the mountain pass for the road linking Syracuse to Palermo, for centuries a key strategic point on the island. After a long and desperately fought resistance, Henna fell, enabling the Muslims to dominate strategic movement on the island. In Sicily, as in Syria 2 centuries before, any Roman fortress was called a caser, from castrum in Latin. Castrum Enna became Casarjana, and was, up to 1926, known by the locals as Castroianni, when Mussolini's officials, with the historical shallowness common among nationalists, decreed that it should be called Castro Giovanni, John's Castle. The famous Greco-Roman city of Syracuse, once home to the scientist Archimedes, fell in 878, after a long siege. Here is the report of Ibn Idari al-Marakushi on its fall on the 21st of May of that year. Quote, Syracuse was conquered on the 14th of the month of Ramadan. More than 4,000 barbarians were killed there, and never in another city of polytheism was there so much booty. None of the men were spared. The Muslims of Sicily had besieged the city for 9 months and remained there for 2 months after the conquest, after which they destroyed it. End quote. The rest of the population was enslaved and deported to Palermo, thereby forever shifting the population centre from the east coast to the northwest of the island. As always, when a city fell, the particular Muslim religious distinction between the status of men and women largely determined one's fate. By the late 700s, Islamic jurists were meticulously codifying what had been the traditional practices of warfare, which they dated back to the time of the Prophet. Here is a ruling of the Hanifa school at Baghdad around the year 800. Quote, "Whenever the Muslims besiege an enemy stronghold, which agrees to surrender on certain conditions that will be decided by a representative of the besiegers, and this man decides that their fighters are to be executed and their women and children taken into captivity, this is a lawful decision." End quote. Finally, on the 1st of August 902, a siege fiercely resisted by the Romans ended with their deaths as the Muslims stormed the fortress of Taormina, the last Roman stronghold on the island. In modern accounts, the protracted and sanguinary resistance of the Romans in Sicily to the Islamic conquest is almost universally discounted, with the narrative of the tourist guides stressing the Sicilian Emirates' irrigation works and the introduction of various citrus fruits and sugarcane plantations, which brought prosperity to the island. The Emirate of Sicily from 940 to 1050 was indeed prosperous. The population of Palermo, which the Muslims called Medina, the city, is claimed by Muslim chroniclers to have reached 350,000. More recent estimates, based on urban patterns elsewhere in the Muslim world at that time, suggest perhaps a population of 100,000. What is omitted in this Arcadian picture is that Palermo could grow to such disproportionate size because it was a major naval base for warfare, for razzia by sea and slave-taking. Indeed, our word arsenal comes from this time and probably from this place. The Arabic term was dar as-sinna, a house or abode of fabrication, where work is done and things are made. Dar as-sinna migrated to Tarrasana in the Sicilian dialect, Atarrachana in Castilian, and in Venice pronounced as Arsenal, from whence in the 1500s it entered English. Al-Madinah, Palermo, being on the front line, but also Mahdia in North Africa and Denia in Spain, were great armament and naval fitting-out manufactories with large workforces. Their purpose was the enterprise of raiding. The term piracy doesn't come close to what this was about. The Palermo dockyard was a giant machine of war and predation, and the city flourished from it. Expeditions triumphantly returned with rich cargoes of booty, their holds crowded with terrified slaves. By the 940s, the pattern that was to dominate the Western Mediterranean for the following 700 years was already fully established. As the historian Pirenne put it, quote, "Muslim fleets sailed it, the Mediterranean, in complete mastery. Commercial flotillas transported the products of the West to Cairo, or pirate fleets devastated the coasts of Provence and Italy and put towns to the torch after they had been pillaged and their inhabitants captured to be sold as slaves." End quote. One may wonder why, as the power of the Emirates of Cordova, of Ifriqiya, of Sicily, all within easy reach of an Italy and southern Europe that by the early 900s had disintegrated politically and were in many respects on their knees, why a great part of it, such as Italy, was not invaded and conquered outright by just one of these emirs. It was entirely feasible. For this was the time when the Emir of Cordova, Abd ar-Rahman III, had sufficient power to assume the supreme title of Islam, that of Khalifa, the Caliph. He built a great pleasure palace for himself outside the city, the Madinat al-Jarrah, modelled on those of Baghdad. He further embellished and extended the great mezquita, or mosque, for which Cordova is so justly famous, completed in 987. This remarkable building, using a forest of Roman columns gathered from far and near, clearly imitates and was intended to outdo the great mosque at Damascus. Another aspect of Abd ar-Rahman's program to boost his prestige as challenger to the Caliph at Baghdad was the acquisition of a substantial library of manuscripts, together with patronage of religious and secular specialists to use it. But the political context was that this caliph was preoccupied with wars not only against the emergent Christian kingdoms to the north, Leon and Castile, but more importantly, in a struggle to oppose Fatimid power in Ifriqiya. These tensions among the greatest Muslim princes of the Western Mediterranean contributed to sparing Aquitaine, Provence, and Italy from an invasion during their period of greatest vulnerability. Instead, the emirs left a razzia against the infidels as a praiseworthy business activity to bands of jihadi entrepreneurs. Muslim razzias from the sea into Europe's southern coastal regions were continuous, and they cut deep, from the early 800s right through to the early 1000s. European shipping had largely been terrorized from the high seas. Only Gaeta, Amalfi, and sometimes Naples sent out escorted merchant flotillas. It was safe and easy for Muslim freebooters to sail at will in their search for rich targets. In 812, Ischia, just opposite Naples, was plundered by the Muslims and its entire populace put in chains and embarked for a life of slavery. Responding to the call of the imperial patricius of Sicily, ships from Amalfi and Gaeta pursued the raiders as far as Lampedusa, but failed to free the Christians, who were probably taken to be sold in Ifriqiya. The following year, in 813, the Muslims raided and sacked the imperial Roman city of Centumcelle, modern Civitavecchia, 80 kilometers north of Rome. Southern Italy at this time was still, as it had been for over 2 centuries, in a state of tense coexistence between the remains of the Roman Empire at cities like Naples, Amalfi, Gaeta, and the Lombard Principality of Benevento. The Neapolitan upper classes still lived under the cultural glow of Constantinople, although effectively they were the masters of their own city. They spoke Latin and Greek, and they liked to use this as a marker to set themselves above the parvenu Lombard aristocracy who were their neighbours. It was this tension which, in 837, first brought the Muslims onto the Italian mainland as mercenaries to repel the Lombard king Sicardos, who threatened Naples' independence. In an act of cynical opportunism, the Neapolitans aided the Saracen siege of Roman Messina in 842. In 838, Muslim forces sacked the Roman city of Brindisi and occupied Taranto. An attempt was being made to move onto the Italian mainland permanently. By 847, an emirate was set up at the city ports of Bari and Taranto. Mufarrag ibn Salam requested the Caliph of Baghdad for recognition as the wali of a new conquest, which was granted. In both cities, mosques and palaces were built, and they flourished from the proceeds of raiding north through Apulia. So great were the predations of this emirate of Bari, sacking the revered sanctuary of Sant'Angelo sul Gargano, that the Carolingian king of Italy, Ludovicus II, with the help of a fleet sent by Emperor Basil from Constantinople, succeeded in extinguishing the emirate in the 870s. Taranto and Bari became cities of the Roman Empire of Constantinople once again. The Roman authorities found that so many of the population of these cities had been deported as slaves and had been replaced by Muslim immigrants from Sicily and Africa, that they had them in turn enslaved and replaced by Greek Christian colonists from the Eastern Empire. Some years later, in 891, a storm drove a Muslim vessel into the protective cove of Saint-Tropez in southern Gaul. The crew saw what a wonderful strategic setting it was and brought the news back to Denia in Spain. Soon, substantial forces were sailing thither to build a fortress in the rugged mountains, inland above Saint-Tropez, which became known as Fraxinetum Saracenorum, Gare la Fresnaye today. The mountain became known as Mons Maurus in the chronicles, and the whole range still appears in modern maps as Le Massif des Maures, the Massif of the Moors. From Fraxinetum, for the next 80 years, raiding parties set forth, ranging far and wide. They systematically laid waste to the whole of Provence, turning it into a wasteland. Quote, verum terram fructiferam in solitudinem redere, end quote, as the chronicler expressed it, reducing a truly fruitful land to a place of solitude. Decades of razzias from Fraxinetum dealt the coup de grace to the once densely populated, urbanized, and prosperous south of Roman Gaul, turning it, relative to the north, into the impoverished backwater that it was to remain until the late 19th century. The reach of these razzias from Fraxinetum was immense. They struck deep into the passes of the Alps, where the Moroccan Ghazi were feared for their great skill in mountain warfare and the cruelty of their methods. They spread down into the plain of Piedmont, preying on the cities of Asti, Acqui, and Alessandria, striking out as far as Pavia on occasion, as well as along the Ligurian Riviera. Their purpose was the robbing and holding for ransom of pilgrims, merchants, and other travellers from northern Europe, passing to and from Rome. They built fortresses throughout the region under their control, the so-called Castra Saracenorum, such as that at Tortona. Their raiding parties regularly infested the Alpine passes as far as St. Moritz in the eastern Alps, the present-day ski resort. By 950, Berengario di Ivrea, temporarily king of Italy, found the situation to be so bad that he established 3 frontier marches facing the area of Muslim raids in Piedmont and Liguria. The whole region, from the Rhone in the west almost to the Po in the east, became subject to the rule of the Saracens, who were content to exploit it through systematic attacks, extortion, and captive-taking, rather than to set up a permanent emirate. Between 890 and 960, a period of 70 years, the whole region of Liguria-Piedmont, in extension of the conditions in Provence, was rendered another wasteland. In 970, when the victor over the Magyars at Lechfeld, King Otto I, travelled with his army through this region on his way to Rome, his chronicler remarked, quote, transivimus per deserta langarum et reliquimus ea sine tributo. End quote. We traversed the deserted places of the Lang region and left it without asking for tribute. The south of France and northwest Italy was not the only region to suffer this experience. In 876, Athanasius, bishop and then also Duke of Naples, received a letter from Pope Ioannes VIII asking him to break Naples' alliance with the Muslims of Sicily. He refused, and in 879 the Pope excommunicated him. Athanasius had been undisturbed that increasing numbers of Saracens had been arriving and were establishing a settlement inland from Minturno. There in the mountains they built a ribat, or fortified citadel of the type used in North Africa. As it happened on a disastrously grander scale in the civil wars among the Goths in Spain in 711, one Christian contestant naively sought advantage by inviting in a beast of prey big enough to devour both himself and his rival. The Muslims at Minturno began laying waste the surrounding countryside, destroying the famous monastery of Monte Cassino again in 883, and rendering the castles, monasteries, towns, and villages of the region burnt-out shells. In 890 they destroyed the abbey of Farfa, which still exists, far to the north of Rome, and converted it into a fortified forward base for themselves. They soon had a ring of such raiding forts in the mountains surrounding Rome on all sides. In Vicovaro, near Tivoli, to the west of Rome, at Narni, to the north, and elsewhere. We know of these only because by chance the few chronicles picked them out for mention. Another forward base was set up at Nettuno, near Anzio, on the coast, affording a virtual encirclement of Rome by land and by sea. Again, they preyed upon pilgrims, merchants, and anyone and any place that was not strongly defended. In this time, as many of the churches and monasteries as could afford it were fortified, like the wall and tower protecting the Basilica of San Paolo fuori le mura, just outside Rome. For a period in the early 900s, all that separated the range of Muslim predation in Provence, Piedmont, Liguria from that in southern and central Italy was the Duchy of Tuscany. The fight back was slow to materialize. Internal divisions continued to offer indigenous allies to the invaders. The papacy proved to be the rallying point when, in 915, Pope Ioannes X persuaded the Christian factions of Italy momentarily to unite against the common danger. The emperor in Constantinople sent a significant Roman land army to southern Italy, and Pope John led his own troops from Latium in person. We can note here as an aside that the ancient Christian taboo against bloodletting, especially for priests, was being transformed in the Occident by the extremity of conditions imposed by the 10th century invasions into a Christian practice and ideology of holy war, in answer to the by then centuries-old practice of jihad. The united Christian forces, even including those of Naples, began to counterattack. Small raiding bands of Ghazi were taken by surprise to the north and east of Rome and found that they, the predators, had suddenly become the prey. Those in the outlying fortresses retreated south to their fortified ribat at Minturno and tried to withstand the siege of the Christians. Running out of food, they made a break for the coast in the hope of taking ship to Sicily. Most of them met the grisly fate that they had meted out to others over the previous decades. The Saracen infestation of southern France and northwestern Italy continued, however, as did the raiding of coastal settlements by corsair flotillas from Africa, Sicily, Spain, from Sardinia, and from Corsica. The first effort to deal with the festering wound of Fraxinetum was led in 942 by Ugo of Arles. A Roman fleet from Constantinople cleared Muslim ships from the Bay of Saint-Tropez. But an internal power struggle loomed with Berengario di Ivrea in Lombardy, and Ugo led his forces to confront him instead. The predations continued. Finally, decades later, in the 970s, the arrival in Italy of Emperor Otto I settled local power struggles and released the counts of the marches of Montferrat and Liguria to move against the Saracens, which they did with success. In 972, the Gazi overreached themselves. In the St. Bernard Pass in the Alps, they caught Beatus Pater Maiolus, Holy Father Maiolus, Abbot of Cluny, a man so famous in Christendom that he had been offered and had refused the papacy on several occasions. Interrogated in their mountain hideout, he responded, Se in hoc mundo nihil proprium possidere, that he himself owned no property in this world. Nevertheless, the monks of Cluny melted down the costliest ornaments on their abbatial altar in order to pay the ransom of 1,000 pounds of silver demanded by the Saracens for his safe release. This outrage against the holy man was enough to stir the Provençal and Italian nobility into concerted action. Counts and warriors gathered from all of Provence and Piedmont Montferrat. They were led by Willem of Provence and Arduinus, Marchese of Torino. The process of destroying the hold of the Muslims on Provence was long and difficult. Each outlying fortress had to be besieged and taken. Among them were those at Monginevro, Pragalato, Grenoble, Embrun, Gap, and Briançon. The set-piece clash occurred at the town of Tourtour in Provence. As in central Italy, once defeated, the Saracens retreated into their chief fortress at Fraxinetum, and again they were forced out, scattering in the surrounding hills. Those who laid down their arms were said to have been spared. The Muslims who had, over the preceding 8 decades, settled in the villages around Provence were unmolested and began the long process of assimilating to the way of life and outlook of the indigenous population. The result, both in northwest Italy and in Provence, was the formation of some important feudal dominions. Willem or Guillaume became the first Comte de Provence, Count of Provence, the counties of Torino and Monferrato became family and political entities of long duration. By 980 then, the final and most devastating Muslim stronghold on mainland Europe had been extinguished. As Christendom approached the first millennium of its own dating system, it was emerging from a century and more of terrible experiences. Almost everywhere, destruction and insecurity were routine to the people who lived through that time. It was a trial by ordeal which tested the inner capacities of the society, of its politics and its culture. These showed that there was an inner resilience, a capacity to come back even from the effects of the worst assaults. What emerged was a tougher, if more fragmented society, one poised to release its energies in a great wave in the coming centuries. For, from about the 980s onwards, Latin Christendom slowly began to unleash its potential in all spheres.